The morning sun painted golden streaks across the Atlanta International Airport's massive windows as a distinguished woman in her mid-30s walked confidently through the terminal, her heels clicking rhythmically against the polished floor. Her perfectly pressed navy suit and leather briefcase spoke of the countless business trips she'd taken as one of the city's top corporate attorneys. This particular Monday morning felt different, though. After winning a major case the previous week, she had treated herself to a first-class ticket to Los Angeles. It wasn't her first time flying first class, far from it. As a frequent business traveler, she'd earned her status through countless miles in the air and numerous corporate accounts. As she approached her gate, she couldn't help but smile at the thought of the comfortable 6-hour journey ahead. The boarding process went smoothly, and she found her seat in the spacious first-class cabin. The leather seat felt luxurious as she settled in, placing her briefcase in the overhead compartment and her laptop bag under the seat in front of her. Other passengers in first class were already being attended to with warm smiles and professional courtesy. A flight attendant moved through the cabin, distributing complimentary headphones to passengers, a standard first-class amenity on long-haul flights. She noticed the attendant serving everyone around her, yet somehow missing her seat each time they passed by. She observed as the gentleman to her right received his headphones with a cheerful, "Here you are, sir," and the couple across the aisle got theirs with an equally warm greeting. Yet despite making eye contact several times, the attendant seemed to look through her as if she were invisible. At first, she thought it might have been an honest oversight. After all, everyone could have an off day, and simple mistakes happen. But as the minutes ticked by and she watched every other first-class passenger receive their amenities, a familiar feeling settled in her stomach, one she had hoped wouldn't follow her to 35,000 feet. She took a deep breath, remembering all the times she'd faced similar situations in boardrooms, restaurants, and high-end stores. Years of experience had taught her that maintaining composure was crucial in these moments. She straightened her jacket and prepared to address the situation with the same professional demeanor that had earned her respect in courtrooms across the country. The flight attendant passed by again, this time arranging magazines in a nearby compartment. She raised her hand slightly, the way she'd done countless times in business meetings when she needed to make her voice heard. "Excuse me," she said politely, her voice carrying the warmth and authority that had become her trademark in professional settings. Little did anyone know that this simple request for headphones would set in motion a series of events that would not only change her flight experience, but would eventually transform the airline's entire approach to customer service. As she waited for the flight attendant to acknowledge her, she had no idea that her next actions would soon have the entire crew and her fellow passengers witnessing something they'd never forget. The flight attendant finally turned toward her, and something in their expression shifted. A subtle change that the attorney had seen countless times before. It was that fleeting moment of surprise, followed by barely concealed doubt, that she'd learned to recognize throughout her successful career. "Yes," the flight attendant said, their voice carrying a notably different tone than the warm greetings offered to other passengers just moments before. "I noticed the first-class headphones are being distributed," she said with a pleasant smile. "I haven't received mine yet." She kept her voice steady and professional, the same voice that had won over difficult judges and opposing counsel. The flight attendant's response came with an air of skepticism that was hard to miss. "Are you sure you're in the right cabin?" They glanced at the seat number, then back at her. "These are first-class seats." Without letting her smile falter, she reached for her boarding pass and her laptop bag. Years of experience had taught her to always keep documentation close at hand. "Yes, I am. Here's my boarding pass, seat 2D. She held it up, the first-class seat assignment clearly visible. The flight attendant examined the boarding pass with an intensity that wasn't shown to other passengers. "Oh, this must be an upgrade," they said, more to themselves than to her. "We usually save our premium amenities for our regular first-class passengers." A businessman across the aisle looked up from his newspaper, his eyebrows raised at the exchange. The couple seated nearby stopped their conversation, the awkwardness of the situation filling the cabin like a heavy cloud. "I'm a frequent flyer with your airline," she explained calmly, pulling out her platinum membership card. "I've been flying first class on this route for the past 3 years." Her words were measured, each one carefully chosen to educate rather than accuse. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, now aware of the attention from other passengers. "Let me check with my colleague about the availability of additional headphones," they said, turning away quickly. As the flight attendant walked away, she noticed several passengers exchanging glances. An elderly woman, 2 rows ahead, turned around to give her a sympathetic look. The businessman across the aisle shook his head disapprovingly, not at her, but at the situation unfolding before him. She took this moment to pull out her phone and quietly note down the time and details of the interaction. Her legal training had taught her the value of documentation, though she hoped she wouldn't need it. She wasn't looking to create problems. She simply wanted to be treated with the same respect as every other passenger in the cabin. Minutes ticked by, and still no headphones appeared. Other flight attendants passed through the cabin, carefully avoiding eye contact. The original flight attendants seemed to have disappeared entirely. The pre-flight service continued around her as if she were invisible, with drinks being offered to everyone else in first class. Just as she was considering pressing her call button, a different crew member approached. This time, it was the lead flight attendant. The way they carried themselves suggested this situation was about to either improve dramatically or become even more complicated. "I understand there's some confusion about the headphones," the lead flight attendant said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Their tone suggested they were preparing to explain airline policy, but they had no idea they were addressing someone who had spent her career understanding and fighting against subtle forms of discrimination. What happened next would leave a lasting impression on everyone in that first-class cabin, as she prepared to handle the situation in a way that would command respect while creating an opportunity for real change. The lead flight attendant stood in the aisle, hands clasped in front, wearing what could only be described as a practiced customer service smile. "I understand you're requesting headphones," they began, their tone suggesting they were about to deliver unwelcome news. "However, we're experiencing some supply issues in first class today." The attorney noticed how several passengers around her were now openly watching the interaction, their own complimentary headphones sitting unused in their laps. A young woman across the aisle actually removed her headphones, as if listening more intently to what was unfolding. "That's interesting," the attorney replied, her voice carrying the same calm authority she used in courthouse negotiations. "I couldn't help but notice that every other passenger in first class has received their headphones." She gestured gracefully around the cabin. "Perhaps you could help me understand the nature of these supply issues." The lead flight attendant's smile tightened slightly. "Well, you see, we have to prioritize our regular first-class passengers." They paused, seemingly realizing how that sounded. "Perhaps we could offer you headphones once we begin our economy class service." A quiet murmur rippled through the first-class cabin. The businessman who had been watching earlier closed his laptop with an audible snap, his disapproval evident. The elderly woman 2 rows ahead turned around again, this time shaking her head in disbelief. Instead of responding immediately, the attorney reached into her laptop bag and pulled out her phone again. "I see," she said, her fingers moving across the screen with purpose. "Would you mind repeating that policy? I'd like to make sure I understand it correctly." Her tone remained professional, but there was an edge of determination that made the lead flight attendant shift uncomfortably. Well, that's not exactly a written policy," they stammered, suddenly less certain. "It's more of a guideline we sometimes follow." "A guideline," the attorney repeated thoughtfully, still typing on her phone. "And could you please tell me your name and employee number?" "For my records." She looked up, meeting their eyes with unwavering professionalism. The lead flight attendant's composure began to crack. They glanced around the cabin, perhaps just now realizing how many passengers were witnessing this exchange. The young woman across the aisle had pulled out her own phone and appeared to be taking notes as well. "I'll need to check with the captain about this situation," the lead flight attendant said, starting to step away. But the attorney wasn't finished. "Before you go," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I'd like to document the names of all crew members involved in this incident." She turned to her fellow passengers. "And if anyone here would be willing to share their contact information as witnesses to this interaction, I would greatly appreciate it." The response from the cabin was immediate. The businessman across the aisle pulled out his business card. The elderly woman was already writing down her phone number. Even a quiet passenger in the window seat who hadn't seemed to be paying attention reached for their wallet. The lead flight attendant's face paled slightly as they watched this display of solidarity. What had started as a simple request for headphones had evolved into something much larger. A moment that would force the airline to confront its underlying biases. Just then, a man in an expensive suit, several rows ahead, stood up. He had been silently observing the entire scene, and something in his demeanor suggested this situation was about to take yet another unexpected turn. As he made his way toward them, the lead flight attendant's expression changed from concern to something approaching alarm. The attorney remained perfectly composed in her seat, knowing that sometimes the most powerful move is simply to stay still and let events unfold. She had faced countless challenging situations in her career, and experience had taught her that patience often revealed the best path forward. The well-dressed man who had risen from his seat approached with measured steps, his airline executive pin gleaming on his lapel. The lead flight attendant's posture stiffened as they recognized the symbol of authority. The entire first-class cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. "I've been observing this situation unfold," the executive said, his voice carrying the weight of experience and authority. "And I must say, I'm deeply concerned by what I'm seeing." He turned to address the lead flight attendant directly. "Would you please explain why this passenger hasn't received the same service as everyone else in first class?" The lead flight attendant's professional mask began to crack. "Sir, we were just following," they began, but quickly realized there was no policy they could cite to justify their actions. The words trailed off into uncomfortable silence. The attorney remained composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply allow others to witness what you experienced every day. Around her, fellow passengers continued to watch intently, many still holding their phones or notepads, documenting the scene. "I've been flying with this airline for 15 years, she said calmly, addressing the executive. "I'm a platinum member, and I've noticed these supply issues seem to occur rather selectively." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook, flipping it open to reveal detailed notes. "In fact, I've documented similar incidents on 3 separate flights in the past 2 months alone." The executive's expression grew more serious as he listened. The businessman across the aisle nodded in recognition. Perhaps he had witnessed similar situations before but had never spoken up. The elderly woman who had been watching earlier wiped a tear from her eye, moved by the dignity with which the attorney handled the situation. "What I find most concerning," the attorney continued, her voice steady and clear, "is not the denial of headphones themselves, but what it represents. When your staff automatically assumes I don't belong in first class, it speaks to a deeper issue within your company's culture." The lead flight attendant had begun to look genuinely uncomfortable, shifting their weight from foot to foot. Other crew members who had been avoiding the situation now hovered nearby, realizing the gravity of what was unfolding. The executive pulled out his own phone and began taking notes. "You mentioned you've documented other incidents," he said. "Would you be willing to share those details with me? This is exactly the kind of feedback we need to address these issues systemically." The attorney nodded, reaching into her briefcase to retrieve her business card. "I would be happy to discuss this further," she replied. "As a corporate attorney, I've worked with many companies on improving their diversity and inclusion practices. Sometimes it takes an incident like this to spark real change. Just then, another flight attendant hurried forward, carrying not just headphones, but a complete first-class amenity kit, along with a glass of champagne. The contrast between this sudden attentiveness and the previous treatment was stark, and everyone in the cabin noticed it. The executive held up his hand, stopping the flight attendant. "While I appreciate the gesture," he said, "what we need right now isn't just to solve this immediate situation. We need to address the root cause." He turned back to the attorney. "Would you be willing to share your insights on how we can do better?" As she prepared to respond, the attorney noticed something remarkable. The entire first-class cabin had become a unified audience, all pretense of disinterest gone. Every passenger was now invested in this moment of transformation, recognizing that they were witnessing something more significant than a simple customer service issue. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had shifted dramatically. What began as a tense confrontation had evolved into something more constructive. The attorney adjusted her position to face the executive more directly, her expression thoughtful as she considered how to make the most of this unexpected opportunity. "Thank you for stepping in," she began, her voice carrying the perfect balance of authority and collaboration. "But I think it's important to understand that this isn't just about headphones or even about me personally." She gestured to her fellow passengers who were still watching intently. "It's about every passenger who's ever felt they had to prove they belonged here." The executive pulled out the empty seat beside her, settling in for what was clearly going to be an important conversation. The lead flight attendant remained standing nearby, their earlier defensiveness replaced by what appeared to be genuine interest. "In my professional experience," the attorney continued, retrieving a small portfolio from her briefcase, "these situations often stem from unconscious bias rather than deliberate discrimination. The good news is that means they can be addressed through proper training and clear protocols." She opened her portfolio, revealing a series of neatly organized notes. "For instance, in the past year alone, I've noticed a pattern on this airline." She began pointing to specific entries: delayed service, extra verification of tickets, assumptions about seating assignments, small things that add up to a larger problem. The elderly woman who had been watching earlier leaned forward. "I've seen it too," she added softly. "I just never knew how to speak up about it." Several other passengers nodded in agreement, the cabin now feeling more like a forum for meaningful discussion than a typical first-class section. The executive was taking detailed notes on his tablet. "Would you be willing to work with our training department?" he asked. "We have a diversity program, but clearly it needs improvement. Your real-world experiences could be invaluable." The flight attendant, who had initially denied the headphones, approached, their body language completely transformed. I owe you an apology," they said, their voice sincere. "I didn't realize how my actions came across, and I'd like to learn how to do better." The attorney smiled warmly at this gesture of humility. "That's exactly the kind of openness we need," she responded. "Change happens when people are willing to acknowledge their biases and work to overcome them." The businessman across the aisle cleared his throat. "I travel weekly for work," he shared, "and I've seen similar situations more times than I care to admit. Maybe it's time we all spoke up when we witnessed these things." As the conversation continued, other crew members gathered around, many of them taking notes or asking thoughtful questions. The original tension had completely dissolved, replaced by an atmosphere of learning and growth. The executive pulled out his business card, handing it to the attorney. "I'd like to schedule a proper meeting once we land," he said. "This conversation has made it clear that we need to make some significant changes in our training protocols." Just then, the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing they were ready for takeoff. As passengers returned to their seats and fastened their seatbelts, there was a palpable sense that something important had just happened, something that would extend far beyond this single flight. The attorney tucked the executive's card carefully into her portfolio. Knowing that this incident handled with professionalism and grace, would lead to meaningful changes that would benefit countless future passengers. As the plane began to taxi, she noticed the flight attendants treating every passenger with equal courtesy and respect, suggesting that the learning had already begun. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the first-class cabin settled into a rhythm that felt noticeably different from the tense atmosphere earlier. The attorney observed how the crew now moved through the cabin with a new awareness, ensuring their service was consistently warm and professional with every passenger. The executive had moved to a nearby empty seat, occasionally jotting notes in his tablet. "You mentioned you've worked with other companies on similar issues," he said, leaning over. "What changes have you seen make the biggest impact?" She thought carefully before responding. "The most successful transformations happen when companies view these incidents as opportunities rather than problems to minimize," she explained. "It's about creating a culture where every employee feels empowered to do the right thing." The lead flight attendant, who had been serving drinks nearby, paused to listen. Other crew members gradually gathered around during their quiet moments, drawn into the impromptu consultation happening at 35,000 feet. For example, the attorney continued, pulling out her laptop, "I've helped develop training programs that use real scenarios to help staff recognize unconscious bias." She opened a presentation she'd used with previous clients. "It's not about pointing fingers, it's about opening eyes." The elderly woman who had supported her earlier leaned forward again. "Could you share some of those scenarios?" she asked. "I serve on several boards, and we could use this kind of training too." The businessman across the aisle joined in. "My company's diversity program feels more like a checkbox exercise," he admitted. "This kind of practical approach could make a real difference." As the attorney shared more insights, other passengers began contributing their own experiences and perspectives. The first-class cabin had transformed into an unexpected workshop on corporate culture and human dignity. "What strikes me most," the executive reflected, "is how this incident could have gone very differently." He gestured to the now peaceful cabin. "Your approach turned a potential public relations nightmare into a valuable learning opportunity." The attorney smiled. "Sometimes the best way to handle discrimination is to transform it into education," she replied. "When people feel attacked, they become defensive. But when they feel included in the solution, real change becomes possible." A young flight attendant who had been quietly listening spoke up. "I've sometimes noticed things that made me uncomfortable," they admitted, "but I wasn't sure how to address them. Could we develop guidelines for speaking up when we see bias?" The executive nodded enthusiastically, typing on his tablet. "That's exactly the kind of input we need," he said. "We need to empower our staff to be part of the solution." As the conversation continued, passengers from other rows occasionally stopped by on their way to the restroom, adding their own thoughts and experiences to the discussion. What had started as a simple request for headphones had evolved into a masterclass in handling workplace discrimination and promoting positive change. The attorney noticed how the original flight attendant who had denied her the headphones was now participating actively in the discussion, asking thoughtful questions about how to better serve diverse passengers. Their transformation from defensive to engaged demonstrated exactly the kind of change she hoped to inspire. The key, she explained to the growing group of listeners, is to create systems that make doing the right thing the easiest choice. She pulled up another document on her laptop. "Here's an example of how another airline revised their service protocols to ensure consistency." As the flight progressed, the executive's tablet filled with notes and action items. What began as a potentially ugly incident was blossoming into a comprehensive plan for organizational change. The attorney watched with satisfaction as crew members and passengers alike contributed ideas for making air travel more inclusive and welcoming for everyone. 6 months had passed since that memorable flight, and the attorney found herself back in the same airport, preparing to board another cross-country flight. As she walked through the terminal, she noticed subtle but significant changes that brought a smile to her face. The airline had implemented many of the suggestions discussed during that transformative journey. New training posters adorned the staff areas, featuring clear guidelines about consistent service. At the check-in counter, she observed staff members treating every passenger with the same level of respect and attention. As she approached her gate, a ground crew member recognized her from a recent training video, one of several that had been created using insights from that fateful flight. "Your story changed how we do things," they said warmly. "We use it in every new employee orientation now." The first-class boarding process was smoother than ever, with staff members following clear, standardized procedures for every passenger. The attorney noticed how the flight attendants made eye contact with each person, offering the same genuine welcome regardless of appearance or background. Once seated, she pulled out her laptop to review some recent emails. Among them was an update from the airline executive she'd met that day. The message detailed the impact of their conversation. Over 5,000 staff members had completed the new training program, and customer satisfaction scores had improved significantly across all demographic groups. The elderly woman from the original flight had kept in touch too. She'd taken the lessons learned that day to her board meetings, inspiring similar changes in other companies. The businessman had implemented new training protocols in his own organization, creating a ripple effect that reached far beyond the airline industry. But perhaps the most touching message came from the flight attendant who had initially denied her the headphones. They had written to share how that experience had transformed their approach to customer service. Now promoted to a training position, they were helping other staff members recognize and overcome their unconscious biases. As the current flight crew began their pre-flight service, the attorney noticed something remarkable. The attendants moved through the cabin with natural ease, treating each passenger with the same attentive care. There was no hesitation, no subtle differences in their interactions, just consistent, professional service for everyone. A young flight attendant approached with a basket of amenities. Headphones. They offered with a genuine smile, then added quietly, "Your story is part of our training now." It taught us that small actions can have big consequences. The attorney accepted the headphones with a warm smile, remembering how a simple request had sparked such meaningful change. Around her, passengers of all backgrounds were being served with equal courtesy. No questions, no assumptions, no need to prove they belonged. The captain's voice came over the intercom, but this time it included a new addition to the standard welcome message. "We're committed to providing excellent service to all our passengers, without exception. Thank you for choosing to fly with us today." As the plane prepared for takeoff, the attorney reflected on how one moment of standing up for dignity had created lasting change. The airline had transformed a potential crisis into an opportunity for growth, showing other companies that addressing bias head-on could lead to better service for everyone. She opened her laptop one last time before takeoff, reviewing the draft of a new corporate training program she was developing. Based on her airline experience, it would help other organizations create more inclusive environments. The incident that began with denied headphones had grown into a movement for positive change, proving that sometimes the smallest moments can spark the biggest transformations.